A racist judge slaps a black boy in public without a second thought. He's powerful, untouchable, or so he thinks. But within hours, the video goes viral, and his entire world shatters. What he doesn't know? That boy's father is his boss. And now, justice is coming for him. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The imposing courthouse stood like a marble fortress against the autumn sky. Inside courtroom 3A, Judge Walter Langford sat behind his elevated bench, his steel gray eyes fixed on the young black man standing before him. His gavel rested beside his right hand, a symbol of authority he wielded with unwavering certainty. "Your Honor," the defendant, Marcus Thompson, spoke with a trembling voice, "I have evidence that I was passed over for promotion 3 times because of my race. My supervisor even made comments about—" "Mr. Thompson," Walter cut him off, his voice sharp as a knife's edge. "This court deals in facts, not feelings. Your subjective interpretation of workplace interactions does not constitute discrimination." He shuffled the papers before him with practiced indifference. "Case dismissed." The young man's shoulders slumped as his lawyer whispered something in his ear. Walter watched them leave, already focusing on his next case. In the gallery, several of his fellow judges nodded approvingly. During the afternoon recess, Court Clerk David Matthews approached Walter's chambers. "Another efficient session, Your Honor. You certainly know how to keep things moving." Walter straightened his bow tie in the mirror. "The justice system isn't a therapy session, David. Too many judges let emotion cloud their judgment these days." That evening, Walter sat at his usual corner table at LeBlanc, an upscale restaurant where judges often gathered after court. The warm lighting and dark wood panels created an atmosphere of exclusive sophistication. He was joined by 3 other judges, all eager to discuss the day's proceedings. "I heard you handled the Thompson discrimination case today," Judge Patricia Miller said, swirling her wine glass. "These frivolous claims are getting out of hand." Walter nodded, cutting into his perfectly cooked filet mignon. "People want to blame their personal failures on systemic issues. It's becoming an epidemic." "Here, here," Judge William Harrison raised his glass. "We need more judges like you, Walter. No nonsense, no hand-holding." As the conversation continued, Walter's attention briefly drifted to a nearby table. A distinguished-looking black man in an expensive suit was sitting with a young boy, probably his son. The man was carefully helping the child cut his chicken, speaking to him in gentle tones that carried faintly across the restaurant. "Is that Charles Johnson?" Judge Miller asked, following Walter's gaze. "Yes," Walter replied dismissively. "He's making quite a name for himself in the circuit court. Too soft on sentencing, if you ask me. Always talking about rehabilitation and second chances." The boy at Johnson's table laughed at something his father said, his innocent joy echoing through the refined space. Walter turned back to his meal, already forgetting about them. "Speaking of second chances," Walter continued, his voice carrying with authority, "I had a repeat offender trying to claim childhood trauma as a mitigating factor today. Can you believe it?" He shook his head, taking another sip of his Bordeaux. "The justice system should be like mathematics, clear, logical, and devoid of emotional variables." His fellow judges murmured in agreement, but a young waitress who was refilling their water glasses paused briefly, her face showing a flicker of disagreement before she schooled her features back to professional neutrality. Walter didn't notice. He was too busy holding court at his dinner table, just as he had in his courtroom. His certainty in his own righteousness was absolute, his worldview unshakable. He had no way of knowing that the father and son he'd so casually dismissed would soon become central figures in shaking that very foundation to its core. "Order the creme brulee," he told his colleagues with the same authoritative tone he used to deliver verdicts. "It's the only dessert worth having here." As he spoke, young Samuel Johnson's laughter rang out again, a sound of pure joy that seemed to mock Walter's rigid worldview, though he was still too wrapped up in his own importance to notice. The following afternoon, Judge Walter Langford finished his lunch meeting at LeBlanc, gathering his premium leather briefcase from beneath the table. The afternoon sun streamed through the restaurant's tall windows, catching on his gold cufflinks as he adjusted his suit jacket. He'd just won another major case, and his satisfied smile reflected his sense of accomplishment. As he pushed through the heavy glass doors into the warm afternoon air, he checked his watch. Plenty of time to prepare for his next hearing. The sidewalk outside LeBlanc was busy with the usual lunch crowd, business people in suits hurrying back to their offices. Near the entrance, 7-year-old Samuel Johnson was waiting for his father, who was inside settling the bill. Samuel bounced a small rubber ball against the restaurant's brick wall, lost in his own world of childhood play. His navy blue school uniform was neat and pressed, his patent leather shoes reflecting the sunlight. The boy's ball bounced erratically, escaping his grasp. Samuel darted after it, not noticing Judge Langford's imposing figure stepping into his path. The collision was sudden. Samuel's small body crashed into the judge's legs just as Walter was checking his phone messages. The expensive briefcase slipped from Walter's grasp, hitting the sidewalk with a heavy thud. Papers spilled out, scattering in the light breeze. Walter's face turned red with rage as he watched several important court documents flutter across the concrete. "You little—" Walter's hand moved before his mind could catch up. The slap echoed off the building's facade, sharp and cruel. His palm struck Samuel's left cheek with enough force to snap the child's head to the side. Time seemed to freeze. Samuel stood absolutely still, his small hand rising slowly to touch his stinging face. His dark eyes grew wide with shock and confusion, tears welling up but not yet falling. The happy, playful child of moments ago was transformed into a statue of disbelief. Around them, the busy sidewalk fell silent. Pedestrians stopped mid-stride, coffee cups and phones suspended in midair. A woman gasped. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." A young woman in business attire had her phone raised, recording the entire incident. Others quickly followed suit, their devices capturing the aftermath of Walter's violent outburst. "Watch where you're going," Walter muttered, straightening his tie. He bent down to gather his scattered papers, shoving them roughly back into his briefcase. His hands shook slightly, but his face showed no remorse, only irritation at the interruption to his day. Samuel remained frozen, a single tear finally escaping to roll down his reddened cheek. His lower lip trembled as he stared at the man who had just shattered his sense of safety. "Entitled brats," Walter grumbled under his breath as he pushed past the stunned onlookers. "No respect these days." He strode away down the sidewalk, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of what he'd just done. Behind him, the crowd's shock was transforming into anger. Phones continued recording as Walter disappeared around the corner. Murmurs of outrage grew louder. A restaurant server who had witnessed everything through the window was already calling the police. By sunset, the video had exploded across social media platforms. News outlets picked up the story, running headlines like, "Federal Judge Assaults Child Outside Restaurant," and "Shocking Video Shows Judge Striking 7-Year-Old Boy." The clips played on repeat on every major network. The slap, Samuel's shocked face, Walter's dismissive departure. Social media erupted with fury. The hashtag number "Judge Langford must go" began trending nationwide. Comments flooded in by the thousands, expressing horror at the judge's actions and demanding consequences. The video's view count climbed into the millions as public outrage grew with each passing hour. The incident that had lasted mere seconds was now a national scandal, and Judge Walter Langford's carefully constructed world of authority and control was about to crumble around him. The next morning dawned bright and clear, but Judge Walter Langford barely noticed the weather as he strode through the courthouse's marble halls. His phone had been buzzing incessantly since he woke up, but he dismissed the notifications as spam or unimportant messages. He had more pressing matters to attend to, 3 cases on his docket today. As he passed the courthouse coffee cart, the usual friendly vendor avoided his eyes. In the elevator, 2 junior clerks fell silent when he entered, moving to the far corner. Walter attributed their behavior to proper respect for his position, allowing himself a small, satisfied smile. Inside his courtroom, something felt off. His bailiff wouldn't meet his gaze, and his court reporter kept stealing glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. The whispers grew louder whenever he left the bench during recesses. "Did you see it? I can't believe he would." That poor little boy. Walter ignored them all, maintaining his stern demeanor as he presided over a property dispute case. His phone continued to vibrate in his robe pocket, becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. During witness testimony, it rang 4 times in succession. Finally, frustrated by the interruption, he called for a brief recess and stepped into his chambers. The screen showed 15 missed calls, including several from the Chief Judge's office. With an irritated sigh, he returned the call. "Judge Langford," the Chief Judge's secretary's voice was clipped. "Your presence is required immediately in the Chief Judge's chambers." Walter's mood lifted slightly. Perhaps they were finally offering him that position on the appellate court he'd been eyeing. "I'm in the middle of—" "Now, Your Honor, all of your cases have been reassigned." 20 minutes later, Walter knocked on the heavy oak door of the Chief Judge's office, straightening his robes and preparing his most dignified expression. He had rehearsed his acceptance speech in his head on the way up. "Enter," came the stern command. Walter pushed open the door, but his practiced smile froze on his face. The Chief Judge sat behind his massive desk, face like thunder. But it was the other man in the room that made Walter's blood run cold. Judge Charles Johnson stood by the window, his normally warm features twisted with barely contained fury. "Sit down, Langford," the Chief Judge ordered, pointing to a chair. Walter remained standing, his confidence beginning to crack. "I don't understand." "I said sit!" The Chief Judge's voice cracked like a whip. Walter sank into the chair, his mind racing. Judge Johnson hadn't moved from his spot by the window, but his eyes never left Walter's face. The Chief Judge pressed a button on his laptop, turning the screen toward Walter. "Perhaps this will help you understand." The video began to play. Walter watched in growing horror as he saw himself outside LeBlanc, saw the little boy bump into him, saw his own hand strike the child's face. The sound of the slap seemed to echo in the quiet office. The camera caught every detail. Samuel's shocked expression, the tears in his eyes, Walter's dismissive departure. "That's Samuel Johnson," the Chief Judge said quietly, Judge Johnson's 7-year-old son. The blood drained from Walter's face as realization crashed over him. He turned to look at Judge Johnson, whose hands were clenched into fists at his sides. 5 million views, the Chief Judge continued. Every major news network. Social media is on fire. The public is demanding your immediate removal from the bench. I didn't know, Walter stammered, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. "I didn't realize." "No." Judge Johnson spoke for the first time, his voice trembling with rage. "You didn't realize that the child you struck was a human being worthy of dignity and respect. You didn't realize that your actions have consequences. You didn't realize that my son would cry himself to sleep last night, asking me why a judge, someone who's supposed to protect people, would hurt him." Walter sat in stunned silence, the gravity of his actions finally sinking in. His phone buzzed again in his pocket, but he barely noticed. All he could see was the video playing on repeat, his own face twisted with contempt, and the shocked, hurt expression of a little boy whose trust in justice had been shattered by a single cruel act. Judge Charles Johnson paced the office, his measured steps a stark contrast to the fury in his eyes. "The Judiciary Committee held an emergency session this morning. Your actions have brought shame upon this entire institution." Walter shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Surely this can be handled internally. "Internally?" Charles stopped pacing, his voice sharp. "This went beyond internal the moment you struck my son. Every major news network is running the story." The Chief Judge picked up a remote and turned on the wall-mounted television. Channel after channel showed the same footage, Samuel being struck, crying, Walter walking away. Commentators debated the incident with barely concealed outrage. 3 major law firms have withdrawn their clerkship programs, Charles continued. The Bar Association is facing pressure to launch an ethics investigation. The governor's office has called twice today. Walter's face had grown increasingly pale. "It was an overreaction," he said weakly. "The boy ran into me." "His name is Samuel," Charles cut in, his voice trembling. "He's 7 years old. He was waiting for me to finish a phone call, and you struck him because he accidentally bumped into you. I didn't mean to… To what? To hit a child? To show the world exactly the kind of man you are? Charles leaned forward, his hands gripping the back of a chair. Do you know what Samuel asked me last night? He asked if all judges hurt people who make mistakes. Walter flinched at those words. The chief judge cleared his throat, pulling out an official-looking document. Effective immediately, the chief judge announced. You are suspended from all judicial duties indefinitely. You can't do this, Walter shot to his feet. I've served on this bench for 15 years. One mistake, Dash. One mistake? Charles's laugh was bitter. Your one mistake was getting caught on camera. Your real mistake has been years of showing no mercy, no understanding, no compassion. How many Samuel Johnsons have stood before you in court, Judge Langford? How many people have you dismissed without a second thought? Walter sank back into his chair, the fight draining from him. The suspension is just the beginning, Charles continued. You will complete 500 hours of community service at the Riverside Youth Center. A youth center? Walter's voice cracked. That's ridiculous. I'm a judge, not some common criminal. You're a man who struck a child in public, the chief judge reminded him. Consider yourself lucky we're not pressing charges. The center serves primarily minority youth, Charles added. Many of them have faced exactly the kind of systemic prejudice you've perpetuated from your bench. You'll work directly with these children, learning their stories, understanding their challenges. Walter's jaw clenched. And if I refuse? Then the ethics board will have no choice but to recommend permanent disbarment, the chief judge said flatly. Your career will be over. The television continued to play in the background, showing social media reactions scrolling across the screen. Judge Must Go was trending nationwide. Clips of Walter's past controversial rulings were being dug up and shared. You have until tomorrow morning to decide, Charles said, moving toward the door. He paused, turning back to face Walter. My son still believes in justice, Judge Langford. Despite what you did to him, he believes good people can learn from their mistakes. I suggest you don't prove him wrong. Walter sat alone in the office, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force. On the television, a reporter stood outside the courthouse. Sources say the judiciary is facing unprecedented pressure to address not just this incident, but the systemic issues it represents. He watched his own face appear on screen again, twisted with anger as he struck Samuel. The boy's shocked expression, the tears, the crowd's gasps. It played over and over, each viewing making him sink lower in his chair. That evening, Walter sat alone in his dimly lit study, mindlessly flipping through news channels. His own face stared back at him from every station, alongside unflattering headlines. Judge under fire, justice system faces scrutiny, pattern of prejudice exposed. His phone lay silent on the desk, dozens of unanswered messages blinking on the screen. Former colleagues who had praised his decisions just days ago now wouldn't take his calls. Even Judge Martinez, his closest friend on the bench, had texted a terse, "Need space to process this." Walter? His wife Catherine's voice trembled as she entered the study. Her eyes were red from crying. David called. He's not coming home for Easter break. He says he needs time to think. Walter's shoulders slumped. Their son, a law student at Yale, had always looked up to him. What about Sarah? Our daughter deleted all her social media accounts, Catherine whispered. Her roommate called. She hasn't left her dorm room since the video went viral. The television droned on. Sources reveal a history of controversial rulings. Walter clicked it off, but the silence felt worse. How could you? Catherine's voice cracked. That little boy. He was younger than our grandchildren, Walter. He had no answer. The shame that had been building all day settled like lead in his stomach. The next morning, Walter pulled into the Riverside Youth Center's parking lot. The building was old, its red brick facade faded and worn. A security guard escorted him inside, where Ms. Rodriguez, the center's director, waited. Judge Langford, she said, her tone professional but cool. Your duties will include mentoring sessions with our youth, assisting with homework, and supervising recreational activities. Walter nodded stiffly, following her through corridors filled with teenage boys. Some glanced at him curiously, others with open hostility. They knew who he was. "The boys here come from challenging backgrounds," Ms. Rodriguez explained. "Many have faced systemic barriers, poverty, and discrimination. They need guidance, not judgment." They entered a classroom where several teenagers sat at desks. One boy in particular caught Walter's attention, tall, with sharp eyes and a hardened expression. Something about him seemed familiar. The boy looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Well, look who it is." He stood slowly, drawing himself to his full height. "You don't remember me, do you?" Walter struggled to place the face, but then it hit him. 3 years ago, in his courtroom. A smaller, scared version of this boy had stood before him, charged with shoplifting food. "Jaden Matthews," the boy said, his voice bitter. "I stole bread and peanut butter because my little sisters were hungry. Our mom was in the hospital. I explained all this, but you said you had to send a message." The other boys watched intently. Ms. Rodriguez stepped forward, but Jaden held up his hand. 6 months in juvie for stealing food," Jaden continued. "My sisters ended up in foster care. Mom lost her job because she couldn't find anyone to watch me after school anymore. But hey, you sent your message, right?" Walter felt the blood drain from his face. He remembered now, dismissing the boy's explanation as excuses, lecturing about personal responsibility while ignoring the tears in the child's eyes. "I bet you thought you'd never see me again," Jaden said. "Bet you never thought about what happened to me at all. But here we are, and now you're supposed to mentor me?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Man, they really know how to pick a punishment, don't they?" The silence in the room was deafening. Walter stood frozen, facing the direct consequence of his rigid, unfeeling approach to justice. In Jaden's hard eyes, he saw reflected every person he'd ever dismissed, every plea he'd ignored, every life he'd impacted without a second thought. The following days at the youth center felt like a slow torture to Walter. He sat stiffly in his assigned chair, barely engaging with the teenagers who filtered through the mentoring sessions. Their stories washed over him like background noise, until one voice cut through his practiced indifference. "My mom lost everything because of you," Marcus Thompson said quietly. The 15-year-old sat across from Walter, his hands fidgeting with a worn notebook. "She was late to court that day because our car broke down. You wouldn't even let her explain." Walter vaguely remembered the case, a minor traffic violation that had escalated due to a missed court date. He'd thrown the book at her, as he always did, with no-shows. "The fine was more than our rent," Marcus continued. "We got evicted. Mom had to work 2 jobs. I barely saw her anymore. Started getting into trouble." He shrugged. "But I guess that didn't matter to you, huh?" Walter shifted uncomfortably, muttering something about following procedure before calling for the next student. But Marcus's words lingered, joining Jaden's accusations in his mind. Across town in the Johnson household, Samuel sat at his desk, his colored pencils untouched. The young boy who once filled sketchbooks with bright drawings now struggled to pick up a pencil. Every time he tried, his hand trembled, remembering the sting of the judge's slap. Charles Johnson watched his son from the doorway, his heart heavy. Samuel had always been a happy child, greeting everyone with a smile. Now he flinched when strangers came too close, kept his eyes down in public places. "Hey, champ," Charles said softly, entering the room. "Want to draw something together?" Samuel shook his head, pushing the sketchbook away. "What if I do something wrong again?" "Samuel, listen to me." Charles knelt beside his son's chair. "What happened wasn't your fault. That man, he was wrong, not you." "But he's a judge," Samuel whispered. "Like you. Aren't judges supposed to be good?" Charles struggled to find the right words to explain how someone in a position of trust could abuse their power. How could he help his son understand when he himself was still grappling with the anger and disappointment? Back at the youth center, Walter was organizing files, busy work assigned by Ms. Rodriguez, when voices drifted from the recreation room. "Yeah, that's him, the judge from the video," someone said. Man, seeing him here, it reminds me of my own trial. Walter recognized the voice as Kevin Foster's, a quiet 17-year-old who usually kept to himself. He was my judge too, Kevin continued. I was caught with spray paint, doing a memorial for my brother. He'd just been killed in a drive-by. The wall, it was all I had left of him, you know. Tried to explain that to the judge, but he just kept talking about property damage and setting examples. Walter remembered that case. He dismissed the boy's grief as irrelevant to the charges, handed down the maximum penalty for vandalism. 6 months in here plus fines we couldn't pay, Kevin said. Mom had to choose between paying those fines or buying groceries. Sometimes I think, if someone had just listened that day, really listened. That night, Walter lay awake in his bed, Kevin's words echoing in his mind alongside Marcus's story and Jaden's anger. Cases he'd dismissed years ago suddenly returned with crushing clarity. Faces he'd forgotten, explanations he'd ignored, lives he'd altered with the bang of his gavel. He thought of Samuel Johnson's terrified expression after the slap, so similar to the fear he'd seen in countless young faces across his courtroom. How many Samuels had stood before him, their stories unheard, their futures changed by his rigid adherence to procedure. Sleep wouldn't come. Instead, memories paraded through his mind. A mother pleading for understanding, a teenager trying to explain impossible circumstances, a child drawing on a wall to remember his brother. Each case he'd treated as a simple matter of law and order now revealed itself as a complex human story he'd refused to see. Judge Walter Langford arrived at the juvenile center early Monday morning, his polished leather shoes clicking against the worn linoleum floors. The sound echoed through the hallways, a reminder of how far he'd fallen from his prestigious courtroom to this dingy facility. Ms. Rodriguez, the center's director, greeted him with forced politeness. "The boys will be gathering in the common room for morning check-in," she explained. "You'll be expected to participate in their mentoring sessions." Walter's lip curled slightly. "I assume there's some administrative work I could handle instead?" "No, Judge Langford. Your assignment is to work directly with the youth." Her tone left no room for argument. In the common room, a dozen teenage boys slouched in plastic chairs arranged in a circle. Walter took his assigned seat, keeping his spine rigid and his expression stern. The familiar posture that commanded respect in his courtroom seemed to have the opposite effect here. "Look who it is," a voice called out. "Judge No Mercy himself." Walter's head snapped up. He recognized the speaker immediately, Jaden Matthews, now 16. 3 years ago, Walter had sentenced him to juvenile detention for shoplifting food when his single mother lost her job. Walter had dismissed the boy's explanation as another sob story. The other boys snickered. Jaden leaned back in his chair, a bitter smile on his face. "What's wrong, Your Honor? Don't remember me? I was just another case number to you, right?" "Young man," Walter began, using his courtroom voice, "your attitude—" "My attitude?" Jaden interrupted, causing more laughter. "Man, you really don't get it. You're not wearing your fancy robe anymore. You can't bang your gavel and make us shut up." Walter felt his face grow hot. "I demand respect." "Respect?" Another boy chimed in. "Like the respect you showed that little kid you slapped?" The mention of Samuel Johnson made Walter's stomach twist, but he pushed the feeling aside. "That situation was..." "Was what?" Jaden challenged. "Another case where you didn't want to hear the whole story? That's your thing, isn't it? Judge No Mercy. Too important to listen to anybody else's side." The nickname rippled through the room, accompanied by knowing looks and nods. These boys knew him, or at least knew of him. The following morning brought a chill to the juvenile center's halls. Judge Walter Langford found himself in a small office, facing Ms. Evelyn Carter, the center's lead social worker. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes that somehow managed to look stern at the same time. "These children aren't your courtroom statistics, Judge Langford," she said, placing a stack of manila folders on her desk. "They're human beings with stories you've never bothered to hear." Walter shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Ms. Carter, I've heard every excuse." "No," she cut him off firmly. "You've heard what you wanted to hear. There's a difference." She pushed the top folder toward him. "This is Jaden Matthews' file, the boy you sentenced 3 years ago." Walter stared at the folder but didn't touch it. The law is the law, Miss Carter. He committed a crime. He stole food, she said quietly. His mother had lost her job after getting sick. No health insurance, no savings. The boy was trying to feed his little sister. There are proper channels, which take weeks to navigate, Miss Carter interrupted. Meanwhile, children go hungry. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Jaden Matthews stood in the doorway, his face tight with anger. "Talking about me?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Jaden," Ms. Carter started, but the boy's eyes were fixed on Walter. "You know what's funny, Judge?" Jaden stepped into the office. "You're stuck here just like us. What does that make you?" Walter's jaw clenched. "I'm here temporarily." "Yeah? So was I supposed to be? Remember what you said? 30 days will teach you a lesson. But the system you love so much kept finding reasons to extend it. 3 years later, here I am. You must have given them reason. Like what? Being born the wrong color? Not having fancy lawyers? Or maybe it's because people like you see kids like me and decide we're guilty before we even open our mouths." Walter stood up, his face flushed. "That's enough." "No, it's not," Jaden shot back. "For once in your life, you're gonna listen." Ms. Carter remained seated, watching the exchange with careful eyes. "You think you're better than us?" Jaden continued. "Look around, Judge. You slapped a little kid because you thought you could get away with it. Now you're here, just like every other person who thought the rules didn't apply to them." Walter turned away, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't have to listen to this." "Yeah, that's your problem," Jaden said, his voice suddenly tired. "You never listen." After Jaden left, Ms. Carter simply pointed to the case files still on her desk. "Take them, read them, or don't. But remember, your choices affect real lives, Judge Langford." That night, in his sparse quarters, Walter sat on his bed staring at the stack of files. The top one, Jaden's, seemed to mock him. Finally, with shaking hands, he opened it. The details hit him like physical blows. Medical records showing Jaden's mother's illness. Eviction notices. School reports describing a bright student whose grades plummeted when he started missing classes to care for his sister. The police report, stealing bread and peanut butter from a local store. Walter's own words from the sentencing jumped out at him. The law makes no exceptions for sob stories. But it wasn't a sob story. It was a real boy's life, destroyed by circumstances beyond his control, and made worse by a judge who couldn't be bothered to look deeper. Walter closed the file and put his head in his hands. For the first time in his career, he felt the full weight of his decisions, and it was crushing. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the barred windows of the Juvenile Center's meeting room. Judge Walter Langford stood at the back, arms crossed, watching as Ms. Carter arranged plastic chairs in a circle. Teens shuffled in, some dragging their feet, others shooting wary glances his way. "Today," Ms. Carter announced, her voice warm but firm, "we're going to share our stories, specifically your first encounter with the justice system." Walter noticed how some of the boys tensed up. Jaden Matthews sat slouched in his chair, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. "Marcus, would you like to start?" Ms. Carter asked a thin boy with glasses who looked too young to be there. Marcus cleared his throat. "I was 12, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Walking home from the library, cops stopped me because I matched a description. They wouldn't believe the books in my backpack were mine." Walter shifted uncomfortably as Marcus continued. "They held me for 6 hours before my mom could prove I was at the library. 6 hours for reading while black." Another boy, Devin, spoke next. "Mine was at school. Resource officer said my hoodie violated dress code. When I tried to explain it was cold, he said I was being confrontational. Next thing I knew, I was in handcuffs." Story after story poured out. A boy arrested for sitting in his own car. Another for playing basketball in a suspicious manner at a public park. Each tale stripped away another layer of Walter's certainty about the system he'd defended for so long. Then a quiet boy named Tommy raised his hand. "Mine was different," he said. "I got caught shoplifting. Was scared to death when they took me to court." He paused, looking down at his hands. "But I got Judge Johnson." Walter's head snapped up. He actually listened to me, Tommy continued. Asked about my home life, found out my dad had lost his job, that we were living in our car. Instead of juvenile detention, he connected us with housing assistance and job training for my dad. Tommy's voice grew stronger. Judge Johnson said everyone deserves a chance to be heard. Walter felt the room spin slightly. Charles Johnson, the man who'd suspended him, whose son he'd struck, had been quietly working to change the very system Walter had so rigidly defended. Miss Carter's eyes met Walter's. "Would you like to share your thoughts, Judge Langford?" The room fell silent. Walter opened his mouth, but pride locked his jaws shut. These were just isolated cases, he told himself. Exceptions. But even as he thought it, he knew he was lying to himself. Across town in a sunlit bedroom, 7-year-old Samuel Johnson sat cross-legged on his floor. He'd been cleaning his desk when he found it, a drawing from just a few weeks ago. His small hands trembled as he held the paper. The picture showed 2 stick figures holding hands, both wearing wide crayon smiles, one tall, one small. "Daddy and me at the park" was written in wobbly letters across the top. Samuel traced the smiling faces with his finger. He remembered drawing it after a wonderful Saturday when his father had pushed him on the swing so high he felt like he could touch the clouds. Back when he wasn't afraid to play outside, before the man in the suit had hit him. Now the park made his stomach hurt. The swing stayed empty. Even walking past the restaurant where it happened made him grab his father's hand tighter. Samuel folded the drawing carefully and tucked it under his pillow. He wanted to feel that happy again, but the memory of the slap kept creeping back, turning all his happy thoughts into scary ones. Back at the center, Walter stood frozen as the teens filed out after their session. Their stories echoed in his head, mixing with the image of Samuel Johnson's frightened face. For the first time, he couldn't hide behind his rule books and precedents. The human cost of his decisions stood before him in flesh and blood, and its weight was becoming unbearable. The next morning, Walter found himself watching the teens from a bench in the recreation area. His legal pad lay untouched beside him as his eyes followed their movements, not to monitor for trouble as he'd initially planned, but simply to observe. A group played basketball, their laughter echoing across the court. 2 boys sat under a tree, one helping the other with math homework. Near the fence, another teen carefully tended to the center's small garden. These weren't hardened criminals, they were just kids. Marcus, the boy who'd been arrested outside the library, was teaching another teen how to play chess. His patience as he explained each piece's movement reminded Walter of his own son at that age. "That's good thinking, Tommy," Walter heard himself say when one of the boys made a smart play during their game. The words had slipped out before he could stop them. Tommy's surprised smile made something twist in Walter's chest. Throughout the day, Walter found himself drawn into small interactions. He helped Devin with a crossword puzzle. He nodded approvingly when Jaden broke up an argument between 2 younger boys, but each time someone thanked him or smiled his way, he stiffened, retreating behind his wall of authority. As evening approached, Walter sat alone in the center's small staff room. The TV mounted on the wall played the local news on low volume. He was about to turn it off when Samuel Johnson's face appeared on screen. The reporter's voice filled the room. 3 weeks after the incident that shocked the community, 7-year-old Samuel Johnson continues to show signs of trauma. Sources close to the family say the child now refuses to play outside and has developed anxiety around authority figures. Walter's throat tightened as footage played of Samuel clinging to his father's leg outside their home, face half hidden. It's different when you actually watch it, doesn't it? Walter spun around. Jaden Matthews stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "I don't need commentary from you," Walter snapped, reaching for the remote. "You know what's crazy?" Jaden continued, ignoring Walter's dismissal. "You hit a kid for no reason. You know what they do to parents who hit their kids? They take them away." Walter's hand froze over the remote. "But you?" Jaden's voice grew harder. "You just got a timeout. Like it was nothing. Just another day of the system working exactly how it's supposed to." "You don't understand anything about the system," Walter growled, standing up. "Don't I?" Jaden stepped closer. "I understand that if I did what you did, I'd be in jail right now. not hanging out in some cushy rehabilitation center. The truth of those words hit Walter like a physical blow. His carefully constructed defenses began to crack. "You don't know what you're talking about," Walter exploded, his voice echoing off the walls. "You think I don't know what I did? You think I don't see that boy's face every time I close my eyes?" His breath came in ragged gasps. "I spent 30 years believing I was serving justice. 30 years, and in one moment, I became everything I claimed to stand against." The admission hung in the air between them. Walter's hands shook as the full weight of his actions crashed over him. "I did this," he whispered, more to himself than to Jaden. "I hurt a child. I'm no better than—" His voice broke as he thought of all the cases he'd dismissed, all the pleas he'd ignored. Without another word, Walter pushed past Jaden and stormed out of the room. He walked blindly through the corridors, his footsteps echoing off the walls, running from the truth that had finally caught up with him. But there was nowhere left to hide. In hurting Samuel Johnson, he had become the very injustice he'd spent his career claiming to fight against. The realization burned through every justification he'd built around himself, leaving nothing but the raw, ugly truth. Samuel sat at his desk in Ms. Peterson's third-grade class, his pencil hovering motionless over his worksheet. Around him, other students scribbled away, their excited whispers filling the room as they worked on their creative writing assignment. But Samuel's paper remained blank. "Samuel?" Ms. Peterson's gentle voice made him flinch. "Would you like to share your story with the class?" He shook his head, shrinking deeper into his chair. His classmates turned to look at him, their curious stares making his cheek burn where the judge's hand had struck him. "That's okay," Ms. Peterson said softly, placing a reassuring hand on his desk. "You can write it just for me if you'd like." But Samuel couldn't find the words. They used to come so easily, spilling onto paper in colorful stories about superheroes and space adventures. Now, every time he tried to write, all he could think about was that moment outside the restaurant. During recess, he sat alone on a bench near the playground fence. His best friend Tommy called out to him, waving from the basketball court. But Samuel pretended not to hear. The sound of children laughing and playing felt distant, like it was coming from another world. That afternoon, Ms. Peterson called Judge Charles Johnson. "I'm concerned about Samuel," she explained. "He hasn't participated in class discussions for weeks. He's not turning in assignments, and he's isolating himself from his friends." Charles listened, his heart heavy. He'd noticed the changes at home, too. Samuel's bright smile had dimmed. His endless chatter about school and friends had turned to silence. The boy who once couldn't wait to share every detail of his day now gave only one-word answers. The next morning, Charles watched from the bathroom doorway as Samuel stood on his tippy toes to see himself in the mirror. The boy's small hand reached up, fingers gently touching his cheek. Though the redness had long since faded, Samuel traced the spot where the judge's hand had left its mark. Charles felt his throat tighten. His son's reflection showed something no 7-year-old should carry: the weight of broken trust, the loss of feeling safe in the world. That evening, after dinner, Charles sat with Samuel in their favorite spot, the window seat in the living room where they used to read stories together. Samuel clutched his worn stuffed dinosaur, Rex, the one he'd stopped carrying to school because big kids don't need toys. Now Rex barely left his arms. "Son," Charles said softly, choosing his words carefully. "I know things have been hard since what happened." Samuel's fingers tightened around Rex's worn fabric. "Your teachers are worried about you. I'm worried about you." Charles gently placed his hand on Samuel's knee. "What would make you feel better?" Samuel stared out the window, watching as shadows lengthened across their front lawn. The same lawn where he used to play catch with his dad, where he'd chase butterflies and draw with sidewalk chalk. It felt like a lifetime ago. "I don't know," Samuel whispered, his voice small and uncertain. Charles pulled his son closer and Samuel didn't resist. They sat in silence as the room grew darker, the setting sun painting the walls in soft orange light. Samuel's admission, those 3 simple words, carried the weight of everything that had been taken from him: his sense of security, his trust in adults, his carefree childhood joy. In that moment, holding his wounded child, Charles realized that some injuries couldn't be seen, and some hurts couldn't be fixed with simple solutions. His son's innocence had been shaken in a way that no amount of reassurance could immediately restore. Samuel's fingers found the spot on his cheek again, a gesture that had become an unconscious habit. In the window's reflection, father and son sat together, their silhouettes merging as darkness fell, both searching for answers that seemed just out of reach. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the juvenile center's common room, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. Judge Walter Langford stood in the doorway, watching as Ms. Carter arranged chairs in a circle for the day's mentoring session. His presence was unexpected. He usually avoided these meetings like the plague. "Judge Langford?" Ms. Carter's surprise was evident in her voice. "The session doesn't start for another 15 minutes. "I know," Walter said quietly. "I thought maybe I could help set up." The teens filtered in slowly, their suspicious glances making Walter's collar feel tight. Jaden Matthews was the last to enter, his eyes narrowing when he spotted the judge already seated in the circle. "Today," Ms. Carter began, "we're talking about choices and second chances." Walter felt the weight of those words. He'd spent years behind his bench, dealing out sentences like playing cards, never considering the lives he was reshaping. But now, sitting among these kids, his judicial robe felt like a costume he'd been hiding behind. The session progressed, with teens sharing their stories. Walter listened, really listened, for the first time. Each story chipped away at his carefully constructed walls of prejudice and pride. Finally, he cleared his throat. The room fell silent. "Jaden," Walter said, his voice lacking its usual authority, "I'd like to ask you something, if that's okay." Jaden's posture stiffened, but he gave a slight nod. "What would you have done differently if you were given a second chance?" The question hung in the air. Other teens shifted in their seats, watching the exchange with intense interest. Jaden's eyes met Walter's, and for a moment, the judge saw past the tough exterior to the wounded child beneath. "I never got a first chance," Jaden replied, his voice steady but filled with quiet pain. "You saw my record that day in court, Judge. But did you see me? Did you see a 14-year-old kid trying to feed his little sister because our mom was sick? Did you see someone who'd never had anyone believe in him?" Walter felt each word like a physical blow. He remembered that day. He'd dismissed Jaden's case in less than 10 minutes, seeing only statistics and precedents, not a desperate child trying to survive. "The system," Jaden continued. "People like you. You decided who I was before I even opened my mouth. So don't ask me about second chances when I never even got a first one." The room fell into a heavy silence. Walter's hands trembled slightly in his lap, his carefully constructed worldview crumbling around him. Later that evening, Walter sat alone in his temporary quarters at the center. On his desk lay a piece of paper that had been left in the art room, a child's drawing. The colors were bright, the lines confident and happy. In the corner, in careful child's handwriting, was the name Samuel Johnson and a date from just weeks before the incident. Walter picked up the drawing with trembling hands. It showed a little boy and his father, stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun. The joy in those crayon strokes was unmistakable, the work of a child who still trusted the world, who felt safe, who believed in goodness. A child whose world he had shattered with one moment of senseless anger. Walter traced the drawing's edges, remembering Samuel's face after the slap, the shock, the fear, the confusion. He thought about how that little boy would never draw with the same innocent joy again, how he'd robbed a child of his sense of safety in the world. Tears blurred his vision as he held the drawing. In all his years on the bench, he'd never once cried. But now, facing the evidence of his cruelty, the dam finally broke. His shoulders shook with silent sobs as he confronted the full weight of what he'd done, not just to Samuel but to countless others like Jaden, whose lives he'd dismissed with the bang of his gavel. The drawing trembled in his hands, a testament to everything he'd destroyed and everything he needed to make right. The morning sun cast long shadows across the juvenile center's recreation area as Judge Walter Langford watched the teens playing basketball. His usual stern expression had softened somewhat, though pride still kept his shoulders rigid and his jaw tight. He spotted Jaden Matthews sitting alone on a bench scribbling in a notebook. Taking a deep breath, Walter approached him, his footsteps hesitant on the concrete. "Mind if I sit?" Walter asked, his voice quieter than usual. Jaden barely glanced up, but shrugged one shoulder. Neither welcome nor rejection. Walter lowered himself onto the bench, maintaining a careful distance. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of Jaden's pencil scratching against paper. "I've been thinking," Walter finally said, clearing his throat, "about your case. Maybe I was too harsh on you." Jaden's pencil stopped moving. He looked up slowly, his eyes hard with years of accumulated pain. "Maybe?" Jaden let out a bitter laugh. "That's what you came up with? Maybe?" Walter shifted uncomfortably. "I'm trying to—" "You don't get to make it up to me," Jaden cut him off, his voice trembling with anger. "You didn't just ruin my life, you ruined my mom's too." The words hit Walter like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to respond, but Jaden was already gathering his things, leaving Walter alone with his half-formed apology dying on his lips. That evening, Walter sat in his temporary office, Jaden's case file spread before him. His hands shook as he read deeper into the documentation he'd once skimmed so carelessly. The boy's mother, Sarah Matthews, had been battling lupus. The medical bills had been crushing them. Jaden's petty theft, stealing food from a grocery store, had been an act of desperation. But Walter's harsh sentence had forced Sarah to miss work for courthouse visits and meetings with public defenders. She'd lost her job. The family had lost their apartment. All because Walter hadn't bothered to look past his own prejudices, hadn't considered the ripple effects of his decisions. Across town, in a comfortable suburban home, 7-year-old Samuel Johnson thrashed in his bed, caught in the grip of another nightmare. In his dreams, Judge Walter Langford's face loomed over him, twisted with rage. The man's hand seemed enormous, descending toward him in slow motion. Samuel could see every detail: the flash of the expensive watch, the perfectly manicured nails, the darkness in those cold eyes. Samuel woke with a scream, his small body drenched in sweat. "Daddy!" he cried out, his voice raw with terror. Judge Charles Johnson burst into the room moments later, gathering his trembling son into his arms. "I'm here, buddy. I'm here. You're safe." He was there again. Samuel whispered into his father's chest. The mean judge. He was so angry. Charles held his son tighter, feeling helpless against the trauma that haunted his little boy's dreams. When morning came, Samuel refused to get out of bed. "I don't want to go to school," he pleaded, pulling the covers over his head. "What if he's there?" "Samuel," Charles said gently, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Judge Langford won't be at your school. I promise." "But what if someone else gets angry?" Samuel's voice was muffled beneath the blankets. "What if they hurt me too?" Charles felt his heart breaking. His son, once so confident and carefree, now saw danger in every shadow. The simple act of going to school had become an ordeal filled with anxiety and fear. "Please don't make me go," Samuel whispered, and Charles could hear the tears in his voice. "Please, Daddy, I'm scared." The juvenile parole hearing room was smaller than Walter's old courtroom, but the weight of decisions made here felt just as heavy. He sat in the back, watching as 16-year-old Marcus Thompson stood before Judge Richard Hayes, his shoulders hunched under an ill-fitting suit jacket. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know I made mistakes, but I've been taking classes in detention, getting good grades. My mom's sick and she needs me home." Walter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Something about Marcus's posture, his desperate plea, reminded him of countless faces that had stood before his own bench. Judge Hayes barely looked up from his papers. "Mr. Thompson, your record shows multiple infractions during your detention period." "Those weren't my fault, sir," Marcus protested. "There was this group of older kids." "I'm not interested in excuses," Judge Hayes cut him off sharply. The words echoed in Walter's mind. How many times had he said those exact same words? Marcus's public defender stepped forward. Your Honor, if I may, Marcus has shown significant improvement. His teachers have written letters of recommendation. Counselor, Judge Hayes interrupted, his tone dismissive. Your client was caught with marijuana. The rules are clear. Walter felt his chest tighten. He watched Judge Hayes's face, stern, unmoved, convinced of his own righteousness. It was like looking in a mirror of his past self. But sir, Marcus's voice cracked, it wasn't even mine. I was just in the wrong place. Denied, Judge Hayes declared, already reaching for his gavel. Next case. Walter found himself standing before he realized what he was doing. Your Honor? The room fell silent. Judge Hayes looked up, annoyed at the interruption. And you are? Judge Walter Langford, he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. I've been observing these proceedings as part of my community service assignment. Recognition flickered across Judge Hayes's face. Everyone knew about Walter's fall from grace. With all due respect, Walter continued, choosing his words carefully, perhaps we might consider the context of Mr. Thompson's situation, his academic improvements, his family circumstances. Judge Langford, Hayes cut in coldly, you're here to observe, not participate, and given your recent issues, I suggest you remember your place. The words stung, but Walter pressed on. I remember my place very well, Your Honor. I sat where you sit now, making the same decisions, seeing only the law and not the lives it affects. But sometimes, the right legal decision isn't the just one. Across town in Judge Charles Johnson's study, Samuel sat in an oversized leather chair, his small feet dangling above the floor. Daddy? He asked, his voice small. Why did that judge hit me? Charles set down his pen, his heart heavy. Some people don't think before they act, son. But you said judges are supposed to be fair, Samuel persisted. You said they help people. Charles moved from behind his desk to kneel before his son. They're supposed to, yes. Then why wasn't he fair? Samuel's eyes filled with tears. Why is the world so unfair? Charles struggled to find words that wouldn't further damage his son's faith in justice. How could he explain systemic prejudice to a 7-year-old? How could he preserve Samuel's innocence while preparing him for the harsh realities of being a black child in America? Sometimes, Charles began carefully, people make wrong choices. And sometimes the rules that are supposed to protect everyone don't work the way they should. Like when that judge hurt me, Samuel asked, touching his cheek reflexively. Yes, Charles whispered, fighting back his own emotions. Like that. But there are people working to make things better, to make the rules fair for everyone. Are you one of those people, Daddy? Charles pulled his son into a tight hug, feeling Samuel's small heart beating against his chest. I'm trying to be, son. I'm trying very hard to be. The modest apartment building stood in stark contrast to Walter's own affluent neighborhood. He checked the address again, though he'd memorized it from Jaden's file. Unit 4B, Gloria Matthews' home. His hand trembled slightly as he raised it to knock. The door opened, revealing a tired-looking woman in a waitress uniform. Her eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed with fury. Before Walter could speak, the door slammed shut with such force that the frame rattled. Mrs. Matthews, Walter called out, his voice lacking its usual authority. Please, I need to understand. Silence stretched for what felt like minutes. Then the door opened again. Gloria Matthews stood there, arms crossed, her expression hard as stone. Understand what, Judge? She spat the title like a curse. How you ruined our lives. Come to see the damage up close? She stepped aside, a bitter gesture of invitation. Walter entered slowly, taking in the small living room. Bills were scattered across a coffee table. A uniform for a second job, a cleaning service, hung by the door. The walls held photos of happier times. Jaden's elementary school graduation, mother and son at a park, moments before Walter's ruling changed everything. Sit, Gloria commanded, pointing to a worn armchair. Walter obeyed, feeling smaller with each passing second. "You want to understand?" Gloria began, remaining standing. "My son made one mistake. One. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you didn't even listen to his explanation. You saw a black teenager and made up your mind before he opened his mouth." Walter started to speak, but Gloria raised her hand. "Number, you wanted to understand, so now you're going to listen." She paced the small room, years of pent-up anger flowing out. "Do you know what happened after you sent my boy away? I lost my job because I kept leaving early to visit him. Couldn't afford the apartment we had then. Moved here, started working 2 jobs, breakfast shift at the diner, evening shift cleaning offices." Her voice cracked slightly. Jaden was alone all the time when he came back. No mother to help with homework or cook dinner or just be there. He started acting out, getting angry. And who could blame him? His whole future, gone. College dreams, gone. All because you couldn't be bothered to look deeper than the color of his skin. Walter sat there, each word hitting him like a physical blow. He saw the exhaustion in Gloria's face, the worry lines that shouldn't be there, the way her hands shook with suppressed emotion. "I'm sorry," he whispered, knowing how inadequate the words were. Gloria laughed, a harsh sound. "Sorry? Sorry doesn't pay the bills, Judge. Sorry doesn't give my son back the years you stole. Sorry doesn't undo the nights I cried myself to sleep, wondering if my baby was safe in that detention center." She walked to a shelf and picked up a photo. Jaden at 13, smiling broadly, holding a science fair trophy. This was before. Before you. He wanted to be a doctor, you know. Now he can barely trust anyone in authority. Flinches every time he sees a judge or police officer. Walter felt sick. The weight of his actions, not just with Jaden but with countless others, pressed down on him. He thought of Samuel Johnson's drawing back at the juvenile center, of another young life he'd impacted with his cruelty. "I don't expect forgiveness," Walter said quietly. "I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that I see it now. I see what I did. To Jaden, to you, to so many others." Gloria studied him for a long moment. "Seeing isn't enough, Judge. What are you going to do about it?" Later that night, Walter sat alone in his temporary quarters at the juvenile center. He held Samuel's drawing, studying the cheerful colors, the innocent joy captured in crayon strokes. His fingers traced the happy figures, a father and son standing together, smiling. The paper was slightly wrinkled where tears had fallen on it. The shame wasn't about his reputation anymore. It wasn't about his suspended position or public humiliation. For the first time, Walter felt the true weight of his actions, the lives he'd damaged, the families he'd torn apart, the innocent child he'd struck in anger. Samuel sat on his bed, clutching his favorite stuffed bear close to his chest. The afternoon sun streamed through his window, creating the perfect weather for playing outside, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the safety of his room. Every time he thought about stepping out, his heart would race, and his cheek would tingle with the memory of that terrible day. A knock at his door made him jump. "Sam, can I come in, buddy?" His father's gentle voice called out. "Okay," Samuel whispered, hugging his bear tighter. Judge Charles Johnson entered the room, his heart breaking at the sight of his usually vibrant son curled up on the bed. Earlier that day, at the grocery store, an elderly man had kindly patted Samuel's shoulder, and the boy had recoiled as if he'd been struck. The incident had shaken Charles to his core. He sat down carefully on the edge of the bed, keeping some distance to make his son feel safe. "Samuel, I think we need to talk about what happened." Samuel's eyes stayed fixed on his bear, his small fingers playing with its worn ear. "The man who hurt you?" Charles began, choosing his words carefully. "He's learning his lesson." Samuel looked up, his brown eyes filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Is he in trouble like the bad people you see at work?" Charles shook his head slowly. "It's different. He's learning about the mistakes he made. He's spending time with young people who've been hurt by unfair decisions, trying to understand how to be better." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then, in a small voice that made Charles's heart ache, he asked, "But does he even care about me?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of a child's shattered innocence. Charles moved closer, opening his arms. This time, Samuel didn't flinch. He crawled into his father's embrace. "I don't know, son," Charles answered honestly. "But what I do know is that you're brave and strong, and what happened wasn't your fault." Across town at the juvenile center, Walter was organizing files in the activity room when Jaden Matthews appeared in the doorway. The teenager's usual defensive posture was gone, replaced by something else: disappointment. "Judge," Jaden said, stepping into the room, "I saw you visited my mom." Walter set down the files, turning to face the boy he'd wronged so deeply. "I did. She helped me understand some things I should have understood long ago." Jaden walked to the window, looking out at the yard where other teens were playing basketball. "You know what's funny? When I first got here, I wanted to hate you. I wanted to make you feel as bad as you made me feel." Walter remained silent, watching as Jaden struggled with his words. "But then I realized something," Jaden continued, turning back to face Walter. "Hating you won't change anything. It won't help my mom sleep better at night. It won't get me into college." He paused, his eyes meeting Walter's. "You can't fix the past, but you can make sure no other kids end up like me." The words hit Walter with the force of a physical blow. He'd been so focused on his own redemption, on making amends for his past actions, that he'd missed the bigger picture. "You're right," Walter said softly. "It's not about me at all, is it? It's about making sure there isn't another Jaden Matthews, or another Samuel Johnson." For the first time since they'd met, Jaden's expression softened slightly. "You know what the worst part was? When you sentenced me, you didn't even look at me. I was just another case number to you." Walter felt the familiar shame, but this time it came with something else, a clear purpose. Redemption wasn't about erasing his past mistakes or earning forgiveness. It was about preventing more harm, about ensuring no other child would have to ask if the person who hurt them even cared. Walter stood outside Judge Charles Johnson's office, his hand hovering over the door handle. The polished brass reflected his distorted image, a reminder of how far he'd fallen from his previous position of authority. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. "Come in," called a familiar voice. The office was exactly what Walter expected, dignified but welcoming, with family photos displayed prominently on the desk. His eyes caught a glimpse of Samuel in one of them, smiling brightly. The photo must have been taken before the incident. "Judge Langford," Charles Johnson said, his voice carefully neutral. "This is unexpected." Walter remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment." "What can I do for you?" Charles asked, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Walter shook his head, declining the seat. His heart pounded in his chest, but his voice remained steady. "I've made a decision. I want to resign." Charles Johnson's eyebrows shot up, genuine surprise crossing his features. He leaned back in his chair, studying Walter's face carefully. "Resign? Not fight the suspension?" "No," Walter replied firmly. "I've been doing a lot of thinking at the juvenile center, working with those kids, especially Jaden Matthews. It's opened my eyes." Charles Johnson remained silent, waiting for Walter to continue. "I don't deserve that seat," Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I do deserve a second chance at being human. These past weeks have shown me that the system I upheld, the way I treated people, it was wrong. All of it was wrong." The silence in the room grew heavy. Outside they could hear the muffled sounds of the courthouse, footsteps, distant voices, the steady hum of activity. Finally, Charles spoke. "You know, when this all started, I expected you to fight tooth and nail to keep your position. To deny everything, blame others, claim you were provoked." Walter winced at the words, remembering how he'd initially reacted to the incident. "That's who I was," he admitted. "Not who I want to be anymore." Charles Johnson stood up slowly, walking to the window. His reflection showed a troubled expression. "Samuel still has nightmares," he said quietly. The words hit Walter like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on his own journey, his own redemption, that he'd almost forgotten the most important part. The innocent child he'd hurt was still suffering. He wakes up crying sometimes, Charles continued, still looking out the window. He asks why the angry man hit him. He doesn't understand what he did wrong. Walter felt his legs grow weak. He grabbed the back of the chair he'd refused earlier, steadying himself. All his progress at the juvenile center, all his realizations and changes, they suddenly felt hollow in the face of this simple truth. A little boy was still afraid because of him. Walter started, but words failed him. You thought you were on the path to redemption, didn't you? Charles asked, finally turning to face him. That working with troubled teens and understanding your mistakes would somehow make it all better? Walter nodded mutely. My son still touches his cheek sometimes, Charles said, when he thinks no one is watching. He touches it and gets this look in his eyes, like he's reliving that moment over and over again. Walter felt tears threatening to form in his eyes. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office. His footsteps echoed in the hallway as he left, each step carrying the weight of a truth he hadn't been ready to face. Redemption wasn't just about changing himself. The pain he'd caused continued to ripple outward, affecting an innocent child's sense of safety and trust in the world. Walter spent the next few days throwing himself into his work at the juvenile center. He sat with the kids during meals, joined their group sessions, and even started one-on-one mentoring sessions. The teens, who had once mocked him mercilessly, began to notice the change in him. One afternoon, while helping a young boy with his homework, Walter noticed Jaden Matthews watching him from across the room. The teenager's usual hostility seemed different somehow, more contemplative than angry. Later that day, as Walter was organizing some files in the activity room, Jaden approached him. The boy's shoulders were relaxed, his stance less defensive than usual. You're different now, Jaden said simply, leaning against a nearby table. Walter put down the files and turned to face him. I'm trying to be... You know what's funny? Jaden crossed his arms. I spent so much time hating you, blaming you for everything that went wrong in my life, but watching you these past weeks... He paused, choosing his words carefully. I don't hate you anymore. Walter felt his throat tighten with emotion. Before he could respond, Jaden continued. But this isn't about me. Jaden's voice grew serious. You owe it to kids like Samuel to prove that you're different, that people can change, that the system can change. The words hit Walter hard. He nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what Jaden was saying. You're right, he said softly. I need to face him. That evening, Walter made arrangements to visit the Johnson family. His hands shook as he dialed the number, but he knew it was time. He needed to apologize to Samuel face to face. The next morning, Walter arrived at the juvenile center early, planning to complete his duties before heading to meet Samuel. The center was unusually busy. There was a special program that day, and several families were visiting. As Walter walked through the main hall, he froze. Through the glass doors, he saw Judge Charles Johnson's car pulling into the parking lot. His heart skipped a beat when he spotted Samuel in the back seat. The boy was coming to the center. Before Walter could process this unexpected development, a commotion erupted near the entrance. A man burst through the doors, waving a gun wildly. People screamed and scattered. "Nobody move," the man shouted, his voice desperate and shaking. He grabbed the nearest person, Samuel Johnson, who had just walked in with his father. Time seemed to slow down. Walter watched in horror as the man pressed the gun against Samuel's head. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, his small body trembling. I said nobody move, and the man repeated, backing toward a corner. My kid's in here somewhere, and I'm taking him home. Walter's mind raced. Security protocols kicked in, the center went into immediate lockdown. Alarms blared. Staff members hurried to secure the other children. But Walter couldn't take his eyes off Samuel. The boy, who already carried the trauma of their first encounter, was now facing something far worse. In Samuel's frightened eyes, Walter saw every child he'd ever failed, every harsh judgment he'd ever made. Without thinking, Walter stepped forward, his hands raised. "Let me help you," he said calmly to the gunman. "Whatever's wrong, we can figure it out." The man's hand shook, but his grip on Samuel didn't loosen. "Stay back." Walter took another careful step. "I understand wanting to protect your child, but look at the boy you're holding. Look at how scared he is. He's someone's child, too." Samuel whimpered softly, and in that moment, Walter knew with absolute certainty what he had to do. Gone was any trace of the cold, calculating judge he'd once been. In his place stood a man ready to risk everything to protect the child he'd once hurt. Police sirens wailed in the distance as Walter stood in the parking lot, watching officers swarm the juvenile center. His heart pounded when he heard the whispers among the evacuated staff. Samuel Johnson was inside, along with his father and several of the center's teens. Without a second thought, Walter pushed through the crowd. An officer tried to stop him, but Walter shook him off. "I know those kids," he said, his voice firm. "I need to help." Inside the center's main hall, the situation was dire. The gunman paced nervously, his weapon shifting between hostages. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on frightened faces. Judge Charles Johnson sat on the floor, Samuel pressed tightly against his chest. The boy's eyes were squeezed shut, tears streaming silently down his cheeks. "I said shut up," the gunman screamed when one of the teenage girls started crying. His hand shook violently, making everyone flinch. "I need money and a way out, or someone's gonna get hurt." Judge Charles Johnson whispered softly to Samuel, trying to keep his voice steady despite his own terror. "It's okay, son. Just stay close to me. Everything's going to be fine." But his arms trembled as he held his boy, and his eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for any sign of help. Several of the center's teens huddled together against a wall. Jaden Matthews was among them, his usual defiant expression replaced by raw fear. He caught Judge Johnson's eye and gave a slight nod, as if promising to help protect Samuel if needed. The gunman's phone rang, making everyone jump. It was the police negotiator. "I don't want to talk," the man shouted, throwing the phone across the room. It shattered against the wall, making Samuel whimper. "Please," Judge Johnson said carefully, "these are just children." "Shut up." The gunman swung around, pointing his weapon directly at them. Samuel buried his face in his father's shirt, his small body shaking uncontrollably. Judge Johnson pulled him closer, trying to shield him with his own body, his judicial composure cracking under the weight of parental fear. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every minute felt like an hour. The hostages barely dared to breathe, watching the increasingly agitated gunman pace back and forth. Outside, they could hear police megaphones, but the words were muffled by the thick walls. Through the window in the emergency exit door, Walter appeared. He caught Judge Johnson's eye, and for a moment, the two men shared a look of understanding. Walter, the man who had once hurt Samuel in a moment of anger, was now willing to risk everything to protect him. Walter pushed through the emergency exit door, his heart thundering in his chest. The gunman whirled around, weapon raised. "Stop right there." "I'm not here to cause trouble," Walter said, raising his hand slowly. His voice was steady, though his legs felt like jelly. "I just want to talk." The hostages stared at him in disbelief. Judge Charles Johnson's eyes widened, his arms still wrapped protectively around Samuel. The boy peeked out from his father's embrace, his small face a mix of confusion and lingering fear. "Talk?" The gunman laughed bitterly. "There's nothing to talk about. I need money and a way out." Walter took a careful step forward. "I understand desperation," he said softly. "I know what it's like when the system fails you, when you feel trapped and angry." The gunman's hand trembled slightly. "You don't know anything about me." "Maybe not," Walter admitted. "But I know what it's like to make terrible mistakes." His eyes briefly met Samuel's. "To hurt innocent people because you're scared or angry." Walter positioned himself between the gunman and the hostages. His shoulders were shaking visibly, and Samuel noticed it. The boy remembered that day outside the restaurant, how Walter's hand had struck him with such force, such anger. But this was different. Walter wasn't shaking from rage now. "Please," Walter continued, his voice cracking with emotion. "These children have been through enough. Many of them have already been hurt by people who should have protected them." He swallowed hard. "I should know. I was one of those people." Samuel watched Walter intently. He saw the tremors in the judge's hands, noticed how he kept glancing back at the hostages, at him, with worried eyes. This wasn't the same man who had slapped him. This man was terrified, not of dying, but of failing to keep them safe. The realization hit Samuel like a wave. Judge Walter Langford, the man who had hurt him, was now willing to risk his life to protect him. The gunman's composure cracked. His eyes darted wildly around the room and sweat trickled down his face. "Nobody moves," he screamed, waving the gun erratically. "I'll shoot. I swear I'll shoot." Several hostages whimpered. Judge Charles Johnson pulled Samuel closer, shielding him with his body. The tension in the room was suffocating. Walter kept his hands raised, his voice remaining calm despite his racing heart. "Think about what you're doing," he said softly. "These are children. Once you cross that line, there's no coming back." "Shut up." The gunman's hand shook violently. "You don't understand. I've got nothing left to lose." "That's not true." Walter took a careful step forward. "There's always something left to lose. Trust me, I know." His voice grew thick with emotion. "One moment of anger, one terrible decision, it can haunt you forever." The gunman's eyes locked with Walter's. Something in Walter's words seemed to reach him. "I used to think I was always right," Walter continued, "that my anger was justified, but I hurt an innocent child, and it changed everything." He gestured slowly toward Samuel. "Look at these kids. Really look at them. They deserve better than this, better than what I did, better than what you're about to do." The gunman's gaze shifted to Samuel, then back to Walter. His arm began to lower slightly. "It's not too late," Walter urged gently. "You can still make the right choice. Let me help you." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then slowly the gunman's shoulders slumped. The weapon dropped to his side. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Police rushed in, quickly subduing the gunman and securing the weapon. The room erupted in relieved sobs and cries. People rushed to hug their loved ones. But Walter didn't move. He didn't acknowledge the thank yous or the praise. Instead, he turned around slowly, his eyes finding Samuel Johnson. The boy had stepped away from his father's protective embrace. He stared at Walter, not with the fear that had haunted his eyes since that day outside the restaurant, but with shock and confusion. "Why did you do that?" Samuel asked quietly, his voice small but clear. Walter felt tears prick at his eyes. For the first time since the incident, he spoke without pride or pretense, straight from his heart. "Because I owed you that." A week after the hostage crisis, Walter stood nervously on the doorstep of the Johnson residence. His hands trembled as he adjusted his tie. Not a judge's tie anymore, just a simple blue one his wife had picked out. Judge Charles Johnson opened the door, his expression guarded but not hostile. "Come in," he said quietly, stepping aside. The house was warm and welcoming, filled with family photos and children's artwork. Walter noticed how different it felt from his own sterile home. Samuel sat in the living room, perched on the edge of the couch, his small hands clasped tightly in his lap. Judge Johnson took a seat next to his son, protective but allowing the conversation to happen. Walter chose an armchair across from them, maintaining a respectful distance. The silence felt heavy. Walter looked at Samuel, really looked at him, not as a judge, not as someone defending his actions, but as a man facing the child he had hurt. Samuel's eyes held a wariness that no child should have to carry. "Samuel," Walter began, his voice thick with emotion, "what I did was wrong, and I will regret it for the rest of my life." The words came out raw and honest, stripped of all pretense. Samuel's eyes widened slightly. He hadn't expected such directness. "I thought you hated me," Samuel said softly, the words hitting Walter like a physical blow. Walter felt something break inside him. Tears welled up in his eyes, and for once he didn't try to hide them. "No, Samuel. No." His voice cracked. "I never hated you. I hated a world I didn't understand. I was angry at things I couldn't control, and I let that poison my heart. But you..." He had to pause to steady his voice. "You did nothing wrong. Nothing at all." Judge Johnson watched silently, his own eyes glistening. Samuel looked down at his hands, then reached for something beside him, a piece of paper. Walter recognized it immediately, the drawing from the juvenile center, the one showing Samuel and his father, filled with the joy and innocence that existed before that terrible day. "This is how things were before," Samuel said, holding out the drawing. "Before I got scared." Walter took the drawing with trembling hands. The simple happiness captured in those crayon lines made his heart ache. This was what he had damaged, a child's sense of safety and trust in the world. "I'm so sorry, Samuel," Walter whispered, tears now falling freely. "I'm so very sorry." Samuel didn't say, "I forgive you." He didn't have to. Instead, he looked at Walter with eyes that held both wisdom and vulnerability. "Are you still angry inside?" he asked. Walter shook his head. "Not anymore. You and the kids at the center, you taught me to see with different eyes." The marble halls of the courthouse felt different that morning. Walter's footsteps echoed differently, no longer carrying the authority of a judge, but the humility of a man who had finally faced his truth. The chief judge's office was packed with familiar faces, judges, attorneys, and court officials who had worked alongside Walter for years. Some avoided his gaze, while others watched him with barely concealed curiosity. The room held its breath as Walter stepped up to the podium. His hands shook slightly as he pulled out his prepared statement, but he set it aside. No more hiding behind formal words. "For 23 years, Walter began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I've worn these robes believing I was serving justice. But I was wrong." He paused, meeting the startled gazes of his colleagues. "I wasn't serving justice, I was serving my own prejudices." A murmur rippled through the room. Several judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "We talk about blind justice," Walter continued, "but too often we're blind to our own biases. I sent children, yes, children, into detention because I refused to see their humanity. I believed in punishment over understanding and rigid rules over compassion." He saw Judge Matthews, known for his harsh sentencing, frown deeply. But Judge Rodriguez, a younger judge, leaned forward, listening intently. "It took a 7-year-old boy named Samuel Johnson to show me my own heart." Walter's voice cracked slightly. "It took striking an innocent child in anger to make me see what I'd become. And it took working with the very youth I'd condemned to understand the damage we're doing." The chief judge watched Walter carefully, his expression unreadable. "Today, I'm not just resigning from my position," Walter announced. "I'm committing the rest of my life to youth advocacy, to working with organizations that fight against unfair sentencing, to being part of the solution instead of perpetuating the problem." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his judicial badge. The metal caught the morning light, gleaming one last time. "This badge represented power to me once," he said softly. "Now I know true power lies in admitting when we're wrong and working to make it right." He placed the badge on the podium with a quiet finality. The silence in the room was deafening. Judge Matthews stood up abruptly and walked out, followed by 2 others. But Judge Rodriguez started clapping, slowly at first, then with more conviction. Others joined in, not enthusiastically, but with a kind of respectful acknowledgement. The chief judge stood up and approached Walter. "You've given us all something to think about, Walter," he said, extending his hand. "It takes courage to admit fault, especially in these halls." Walter shook his hand, feeling lighter with each passing moment. As he walked through the courthouse for the last time, he passed the familiar paintings of stern-faced judges from decades past. Their expressions seemed different now, less intimidating, more human. Outside, the morning sun warmed his face. For the first time in weeks, he could breathe freely. The weight of his past decisions, his prejudices, his anger, it all seemed to lift away with each step down those courthouse steps. A group of school children passed by, their laughter echoing across the plaza. Walter watched them, seeing not potential criminals to be judged, but children full of possibilities. He thought of Samuel, of Jaden, of all the young lives he'd impacted, for better or worse. His car waited in the parking lot, but Walter chose to walk. Each step took him further from his old life and closer to his new purpose. The courthouse loomed behind him, no longer his domain, but a reminder of how far he'd come. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees outside the juvenile center as Walter Langford guided a group discussion. 6 months had passed since he'd left the courthouse behind, and the changes in him were visible to everyone. His face had softened, the stern lines around his mouth replaced by gentle creases from genuine smiles. "Remember," he told the teenagers gathered around him, "your past doesn't define your future. You have the power to change." From the corner of the room, Jaden Matthews watched silently. He'd been doing that for months now, observing Walter's transformation from a distance. Today, though, something was different in his expression. As the session ended and the teens filed out, Jaden approached Walter. His usual defensive posture was gone, replaced by something close to respect. "You really meant it, didn't you?" Jaden said quietly. "All that stuff about change?" Walter met his gaze steadily. "Every word." Jaden nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You know, I never thought I'd say this, but..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You're doing good here, Mr. Langford. Real good." The words hit Walter deep in his chest. Coming from Jaden, they meant everything. Before he could respond, Ms. Carter appeared in the doorway. "Walter, there's someone here to see you." Walter stepped into the hallway and his heart skipped a beat. There, standing nervously by the entrance, was Samuel Johnson. The boy looked different now. Taller, perhaps, but more importantly, the fear that had haunted his eyes for so long seemed lighter. Samuel clutched a piece of paper in his hands, fidgeting with the corners. As Walter approached, he noticed the boy's father, Judge Charles Johnson, watching from a respectful distance. "Hello, Samuel," Walter said softly, kneeling down to the boy's level. Samuel held out the paper with slightly trembling hands. "I made this," he said, his voice small but steady. Walter carefully took the offered drawing, his vision blurred as he looked at it. There, rendered in bright crayon colors, were 3 figures holding hands. One was clearly Samuel, another his father, and the third, Walter's breath caught, was himself. The figures were smiling, standing under a sunny sky. Above them, in childish handwriting, were the words, "My heroes." Walter looked up, fighting back tears, to find Samuel watching him intently. Then, like sunshine breaking through clouds, Samuel smiled, not the hesitant, guarded smile he'd worn before, but a real, genuine smile that lit up his whole face. "Dad says you help kids now," Samuel said, "like a hero should." Walter had to swallow hard before he could speak. "I'm trying to," he managed. Samuel nodded seriously. "I know. That's why I drew you with us." He paused, then added, "Is it okay if I come see what you do here sometimes?" Walter glanced at Judge Johnson, who gave a slight nod of approval. "I'd like that very much," Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. Samuel's smile grew brighter. "Can I see inside now?" Walter stood up, carefully folding the drawing and placing it in his breast pocket, right over his heart. He held out his hand, and after only a moment's hesitation, Samuel took it. As they walked toward the center's entrance, Walter heard footsteps behind them, Samuel's father following at a distance, giving them space, but staying close. Just before they reached the door, Walter felt a gentle tug on his hand. "Mr. Langford?" "Yes, Samuel?" "I'm glad you changed." Walter squeezed the small hand in his gently as they stepped inside, his heart full of gratitude for second chances and the wisdom of children who know how to forgive. On a bright spring morning, Walter Langford stood at a podium in the community center's main hall. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the diverse crowd gathered for the launch of his youth advocacy initiative, Second Chances First. The room buzzed with energy. Legal professionals in suits mingled with community leaders, social workers, and former juvenile offenders. Banners hung from the walls, displaying statistics about youth incarceration and the initiative's goals for reform. Judge Charles Johnson sat in the front row, his presence a powerful symbol of support. Next to him, Ms. Carter beamed with pride at how far her former reluctant volunteer had come. "We're here today," Walter began, his voice steady and humble, "because every child deserves more than just a first chance. They deserve understanding, guidance, and a system that sees them as people, not statistics." As he spoke, his eyes scanned the crowd, landing on familiar faces. There was Gloria Matthews, Jaden's mother, sitting straighter now, hope replacing the weariness he remembered from their first difficult meeting. Several of the boys he'd mentored at the center sat scattered throughout the audience, dressed in their best clothes, their faces reflecting pride and possibility. "This initiative," Walter continued, gesturing to the presentation behind him, "will work directly with courts and juvenile centers to review and reform sentencing guidelines. We'll establish mentorship programs, provide legal support for families, and ensure that one mistake doesn't define a young person's entire future." Judge Charles Johnson stepped up to join Walter at the podium. "Mr. Langford's proposal includes specific reforms that we'll be implementing immediately," he announced, "including mandatory review periods for juvenile sentences and expanded rehabilitation programs." After the formal presentations, Walter moved through the crowd, stopping to chat with various supporters. That's when he spotted Jaden Matthews standing near the refreshment table. The young man looked different now, shoulders straight, head held high, wearing a crisp button-down shirt and tie. Their eyes met across the room. For a moment, neither moved. Then Jaden walked purposefully toward Walter, his expression thoughtful. The chatter around them seemed to fade as Jaden stopped in front of his former judge. Without a word, Jaden extended his hand. Walter looked at it for a moment, remembering their first hostile encounters, the anger, the distrust. He reached out and grasped Jaden's hand firmly. The handshake was brief, but it spoke volumes. Jaden gave a small nod, his eyes reflecting not just respect, but understanding. "Nice work," he said simply, then added with the ghost of a smile, "Judge." Walter felt something shift inside him, a warmth he'd never known in his old life. His face broke into a genuine smile, not the practiced, professional smile he'd worn on the bench, but a real expression of joy that reached his eyes and softened his whole face. Jaden's own expression softened in response, and for the first time, Walter saw in him not the angry young man he'd sentenced, but the leader he was becoming. Around them, other former juvenile center residents gathered, each with their own stories of transformation, each a living testament to the power of second chances. On a warm afternoon, Samuel Johnson stood at the edge of his front yard, hesitating. The sounds of children playing drifted over from the neighborhood park across the street. His friends Jack and Marcus waved, calling his name. "Go on," Judge Charles Johnson said softly, standing in the doorway. "It's okay, son." Samuel glanced back at his father, then took a deep breath. He stepped onto the sidewalk, then broke into a run toward his friends. His father's heart swelled as he watched Samuel's face light up with a smile, the kind of carefree smile he hadn't seen in months. The children's laughter echoed through the neighborhood as they kicked a soccer ball around. Samuel moved freely now, no longer looking over his shoulder or flinching when others came too close. Though sometimes he still touched his cheek unconsciously, the fear in his eyes had faded. The next morning at school, Samuel sat at his desk during art time. Colored pencils scattered across his workspace as he bent over a fresh sheet of paper, his tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. His teacher, Ms. Rivera, walked by and paused, watching as familiar shapes took form under Samuel's careful hands. 3 figures emerged on the paper. One tall man in judge's robes, his father, another man standing near a group of teenagers, Walter at the juvenile center, and a smaller figure between them, Samuel himself. All 3 wore bright smiles. "That's beautiful, Samuel," Ms. Rivera said gently. Would you like to tell me about it? Samuel looked up, his eyes clear and steady. That's my dad, he pointed, and that's Mr. Langford at the center where he helps kids now. He paused, then added quietly, he's different now. Better. That evening, Judge Charles Johnson found the drawing tucked carefully in Samuel's backpack. He stood in the kitchen, holding it with trembling hands, tears welling in his eyes as he realized what it meant. His son was healing, finding his way back to trust and joy. Samuel walked in and saw his father looking at the drawing. Instead of hiding it away, he smiled. Can we put it on the fridge? He asked. Of course we can, son, his father replied, voice thick with emotion. Of course we can. Walter stood on the Johnsons' front porch, his heart pounding. He'd been here before, but this time felt different. His hand hovered over the doorbell, uncertainty gripping him. Before he could press it, the door opened. Samuel stood there looking up at him with those same deep brown eyes that had once been filled with fear. But today, they held something else, curiosity. Hi, Mr. Langford, Samuel said softly. Then, to Walter's surprise, he stepped aside. Would you like to come in? Walter's throat tightened with emotion. Yes, thank you, Samuel. They sat in the living room. Walter perched awkwardly on the edge of an armchair while Samuel settled onto the couch. Judge Charles Johnson watched from the doorway, his presence protective but not intrusive. The silence stretched between them until Samuel spoke up. Do you really help kids at the center now? Walter nodded, grateful for the question. Yes, I do. Every day. What kind of kids? Samuel leaned forward slightly. All kinds, Walter replied, his voice growing steadier. Some of them made mistakes. Some of them just needed someone to listen. He paused, meeting Samuel's eyes. I wish I had learned to listen sooner. Samuel considered this. Do they trust you? The question hit Walter like a physical blow, but he answered honestly. Not at first, I had to earn it. I'm still earning it. Samuel nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. What do you do with them? We talk. I help them with homework. Sometimes we just sit together. Walter felt himself relaxing slightly. There's this one boy, Marcus. He loves drawing, just like you. Samuel's eyes brightened. Really? He slid off the couch and went to his backpack in the corner. When he returned, he held a piece of paper in his hands. I made this at school, Samuel said, holding it out. Walter's hands trembled as he took the drawing. There he was, standing with Samuel and Judge Johnson, all of them smiling. His vision blurred with tears as he realized what this meant. Samuel had drawn him not as the man who had hurt him, but as someone who belonged in his world. Thank you, Samuel, Walter whispered, carefully holding the drawing. This means more to me than you could ever know. Samuel gave him a small but genuine smile, the first real smile Walter had ever received from him. In that moment, Walter understood he had been given something precious, the beginning of Samuel's trust. Walter stood backstage at the National Judicial Reform Conference, his hands fidgeting with his prepared speech. Through the curtain, he could see hundreds of judges, lawyers, and policymakers filling the auditorium. His heart nearly stopped when he spotted them in the front row, Samuel and Judge Charles Johnson. The conference moderator's voice boomed through the speakers. Our next speaker is former Judge Walter Langford, here to discuss systemic reform in juvenile justice. Walter stepped onto the stage, the bright lights washing over him. He placed his prepared speech on the podium, looked down at Samuel's earnest face, and pushed the papers aside. This wasn't a moment for prepared remarks. A year ago, Walter began, his voice trembling slightly, I struck a 7-year-old boy because he accidentally bumped into me. The audience fell silent. I was a judge then. I wore the robes. I wielded power. And I used that power to hurt an innocent child. He gripped the podium tighter, forcing himself to continue. That boy's name is Samuel Johnson, and he's sitting right here today. A few heads turned toward Samuel, but Walter kept speaking. One moment of cruelty changed both our lives forever. But while I deserved the consequences of my actions, there are thousands of children who don't deserve what our system does to them. Tears welled in Walter's eyes as he continued. Every day I see kids in juvenile detention who are there because judges like me failed them. We saw them as statistics, not children. We forgot our humanity in the name of justice. His voice grew stronger. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here to demand change. No child should fear the system that's supposed to protect them. No child should carry the scars of our prejudices. The silence in the auditorium was absolute. Walter could see some judges shifting uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded slowly. We can do better, Walter said. We must do better, because somewhere right now there's another Samuel Johnson waiting to see if justice means protection or punishment. The choice is ours. When Walter finished, the applause was thunderous, but he barely heard it. His eyes were fixed on Samuel, who was whispering something to his father. As people began to leave their seats, Samuel walked up to the stage. Walter held his breath as the boy looked up at him, those familiar brown eyes studying his face. Then Samuel spoke two simple words that shook Walter to his core. Thank you. Walter stood frozen, overwhelmed by the weight of those words. The first time Samuel had ever acknowledged his transformation. In that moment, all the speeches, all the reforms, all the work faded away. This simple thank you from a child he had wronged meant more than any applause ever could. Walter stood at the familiar podium in courtroom 7, his fingers brushing against the polished wood where he had once presided. The room looked different from this angle, smaller, yet somehow more imposing. Rows of eager law students filled the gallery where defendants once sat. 10 years ago, Walter began, his voice steady but humbled. I ruled from this very spot. I thought justice meant being tough, being unmovable. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the young faces. I was wrong. Some students leaned forward, intrigued. Others crossed their arms, wearing the same skeptical expression he used to see in his own mirror. A young man in the front row scribbled furiously in his notebook. I remember a case, Walter continued, stepping away from the podium to walk closer to the students. A 16-year-old boy stood right there, accused of shoplifting food. I didn't bother asking why. I didn't care that he was trying to feed his younger siblings while their mother worked 3 jobs. He pointed to the defendant's table. I gave him 6 months in juvenile detention. I called it justice. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Walter noticed a young woman shaking her head, while another student nodded in agreement with his past decision. You see, Walter said, I thought being a good judge meant being hard, unmovable. But justice isn't about being rigid. It's about being wise enough to understand. He walked back to the podium, running his hand along the judge's bench. Each person who stands before you has a story. Your job isn't just to sentence them, it's to listen, to understand. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Walter recognized that discomfort. The challenge to deeply held beliefs about law and order. He had felt it himself not so long ago. You'll sit in classes learning about precedents and procedures, Walter continued. You'll memorize laws and statutes. But the hardest lesson, the one I learned too late, is that justice without compassion isn't justice at all. A student raised her hand. But, sir, doesn't emotional involvement compromise judicial objectivity? Walter smiled sadly. It was exactly the kind of question he would have asked at her age. Understanding isn't the same as compromising objectivity, he replied. It's about seeing the whole picture before making decisions that can change lives forever. He walked to the center of the courtroom where countless defendants had stood before him. Each time someone stands in this spot, you have a choice. You can see a case number, or you can see a human being. Choose wisely. The skeptical faces hadn't all disappeared, but Walter saw something else now. Thoughtfulness, consideration, seeds being planted. The Saturday morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Walter made his way to the juvenile center. His footsteps echoed in the quiet street, each step more purposeful than the last. The familiar brick building came into view, its windows gleaming in the early light. Walter's hand hesitated on the door handle. Through the glass, he could see Samuel sitting alone at a table near the window, hunched over what appeared to be drawing paper. The boy's face was peaceful, concentrated as his hand moved steadily across the page. Walter's heart tightened in his chest. These moments still caught him off guard, seeing Samuel so unguarded, so different from the frightened child he'd encountered months ago. He pushed the door open slowly, trying not to disturb the peaceful scene. The center was unusually quiet. Most of the kids were still asleep or away for weekend visits. Walter's footsteps seemed too loud on the linoleum floor as he approached, but he couldn't bring himself to move any closer. He stood there watching Samuel work, reminded of all the pain he'd caused and the long road to healing they'd both traveled. Samuel's colored pencils were spread across the table in a rainbow array. His small fingers moved deliberately, choosing each color with care. Walter noticed how the morning light caught the boy's face, highlighting the gentle determination in his expression. Then, as if sensing his presence, Samuel looked up. Walter's breath caught, still expecting to see fear or hesitation in those young eyes. But instead, Samuel's face broke into a genuine smile, small but real, reaching all the way to his eyes. Without a word, Samuel reached over and pulled out the chair next to him. The legs scraped softly against the floor, the sound sharp in the quiet room. The invitation was clear, simple, and profound. Walter moved forward slowly, giving Samuel plenty of time to change his mind. But the boy just returned to his drawing, that small smile still playing on his lips. Walter lowered himself into the chair, careful to leave enough space between them. The silence that settled over them wasn't heavy or awkward. It was comfortable, like a warm blanket on a cold day. Walter watched as Samuel's drawing took shape, a scene of the center's playground, filled with playing children. The details were impressive. The old oak tree, the worn slide, even the bird's nest in the corner. Samuel reached for a blue pencil, and Walter noticed how his movements were relaxed, unguarded. There was no tension in his shoulders, no fear in his posture. Just a boy, drawing on a quiet morning, sharing his space with someone he no longer feared. Walter felt something settle in his chest, a peace he hadn't known he was searching for. He watched the morning light dance across Samuel's drawing, listened to the soft scratch of pencil on paper, and understood that this moment was more powerful than any grand gesture could ever be. They sat there together, the former judge and the boy he'd wronged, finding healing in the simple act of sharing space. No words were needed. The understanding between them spoke volumes, of forgiveness given and received, of trust rebuilt, of wounds slowly healing. Samuel continued to draw, occasionally reaching across the table for different colors. Walter remained still, honored to be allowed in this peaceful moment. Through the window, the morning sun climbed higher, warming their shared silence with its gentle light. If you enjoyed the story of Judge Walter, Judge Charles, Samuel, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.